A ritual recitation is written into the 26th chapter of Deuteronomy, and every Hebrew child learns it very early in life. It begins, "A wandering Aramaean was my father." It's a short history of how the Jews became a people and how they came to live in what they called the Promised Land. "A wandering Aramaean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number, and there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power and with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Now, in academic terms, that is called the Hebrew Bible's Heilsgeschichte, because in graduate school we like to speak German now and then. It literally means salvation history. It's a version of history told from the perspective that asserts that God made all of these things happen for a reason. The salvation history of the Jews is a symbol for the history of all of the world that followed and the unwritten history of peoples that preceded it. Jewish history begins with a small band of people moving from one country to another in hopes of improving their prospects of having food and a livelihood. Over time, being a part of a non-dominant ethnic group in Egypt made their living conditions bad enough that they left in search of a better place. Now, their own version of that long trip was that God had promised them a land of their own, a land flowing with milk and honey. But a historian might look at that group of former slaves who could not best the Egyptian army that was very strong and well organized, and they wandered north until they found a territory that was dominated by a people that were not organized well enough to defeat them, so they killed them and took their land. If you take the Old Testament narrative literally, God is a pathological land thief. But we know that it wasn't actually God that promised them the land, but just that they found a land that they could conquer. Migrations have taken place since the first early humans wandered out of northern Africa to populate Asia, Europe, and the Americas, and finally Australia, and everywhere in between. Sometimes the migrations were forced, as when the Assyrians carried the natives of Israel away to be slaves, or when Judah was carried to Babylon to be slaves, or when Americans and Europeans captured Africans and took them away to be slaves. Sometimes migrations were forced by famine, as when Jacob took his tribe to Egypt, or when the waves of Irish immigrants first came to the Americas. Sometimes waves of immigration were instantaneous, as people were forced to leave their land by a foreign power or as refugees to escape a holocaust, as Syrians are now fleeing their homeland, or as Jews fled from Germany and Poland in the last century. People move around, but not usually out of sheer boredom. In the ancient world, you might pull off being a pathological land thief by blaming it on God. You understand that Palestine wasn't a land flowing with milk and honey just naturally. I mean, you ask any farmer, a piece of land left to God's management doesn't produce very much of anything. The Semitic tribes that occupied that land around 1000 BC and episodically had control over it for the next 1,000 years, they killed off a civilization that already had farms and an agricultural culture and walled cities and everything that were already there. They just said that God gave it to them. They became refugees again when the Roman Empire took their land. They didn't get it back for 2,000 years until the British and American empires, to call them that, stole it once again from a people that had lived there for 2,000 years. And in my little church in rural Kentucky, We tended to see history as the Bible and George Washington. So we did, our awareness of what might have taken place in between the two wasn't very complete. And so for my people, the reestablishment of Israel in Palestine was natural. It was supposed to happen. They had the title, it's in the Bible. They believed it was still their land. The fact that the sacred book of the Jews gives them title to the land is not exactly an ethical justification. But seeing that requires critical thinking that not only wasn't going on in my little Sunday school class in rural Kentucky, but it wasn't going on in the British Parliament, and it wasn't going on in the American Congress. We saw the solution to a European sin as being a land grab from Middle Eastern people. And it hasn't worked out very well, has it? I don't know how to undo it. But a part of our American myth was a poem that we learned in grade school. Most of you could recite it from memory. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He had 3 ships and left from Spain. He sailed through sunshine, wind, and rain. He sailed by night, he sailed by day. He used the stars to find his way. The poem concludes, the Arakawa natives were very nice. They gave the sailors food and spice. Columbus sailed on to find some gold to bring back home as he'd been told. He made the trip again and again, trading gold to bring to Spain. The first American? No, not quite, but Columbus was brave and he was bright. The poem's a myth. It's a lie, of course. Some of the names and dates reflect actual history. The poem does not say that the Spaniards captured and enslaved the Arawak Indians, and those who refused to be enslaved were slaughtered. There were those who spoke of the Americas as a new promised land, promised by God to Christian invaders. That language survived right up to the time of Abraham Lincoln and continued to inspire the wars waged against the indigenous peoples of this continent. There are now about 300 million people that live in the United States, but our white European forefathers did not find this place uninhabited any more than ancient Semitic tribes found Palestine uninhabited, or modern Jews did not find Palestine uninhabited at the end of World War II. There are estimates as high as 90 million indigenous Indians living here when European settlers began their migration. There are not many other periods in our history when you can say that the Jewish Holocaust pales in comparison to what our ancestors did to the American Indians. Of course, it wasn't entirely a military occupation. European diseases that traveled across the Atlantic in those little wooden ships were more lethal to Indians than were the swords and muskets of the settlers. Still, once early American settlers discovered the lethal vulnerability of the Indians to those diseases, they did everything they could to spread those germs, to do what they could not do themselves. At the end of World War II, many Germans were put on trial for war crimes, and a number of steps were made to heal the sick mentality that led to the Holocaust. In Japan as well, a new constitution was written, and a very ancient culture had to go back to the drawing board to reckon with how they had treated primarily their Asian neighbors in the invasions of China and Korea in their lust for power. In Germany, you would not find a holiday to celebrate the birth of Adolf Hitler. To even suggest it would be offensive to Germans. In the United States, however, we are still Holocaust deniers because we have an official Columbus Day to celebrate the first voyage of Columbus to the New World, to begin the legacy of slavery and carnage. There is no way to put that 15th century migration into reverse, but folks, we can start to be honest about it. Christopher Columbus is a part of modern history, but he's not a bright and shining part of it. calling Columbus brave and bright, how insulting is that to Native Americans? The state of Vermont and the cities of Denver and Phoenix recently joined Seattle, Minneapolis, Albuquerque, and a dozen other American cities in deciding to rename the second Monday in October Indigenous Peoples Day. Now that may seem like a small thing, just changing the name from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, but one of the things I've had to learn over the years is that language makes a difference in how we think. And if we can change the language, we can begin to see the plight of Native Americans differently. Because we still don't treat them very well. It's amazing to me, for the past few months, the largest Indigenous Peoples protest has been going on in North Dakota. The largest ever protest has been going on in North Dakota. It has hardly been mentioned in mainstream media. Minutes, seconds. Alternative news sources, primarily Amy Goodman with Democracy Now!, has extensively covered it, but the people, she and a couple of other reporters, have been arrested and charged with criminal activity, threatened with years in prison for reporting the news about this. It's hard to believe that this is happening in America. Journalists are being arrested for doing journalism. Now, thankfully, the case against Amy Goodman has been thrown out because the judge realized there simply isn't a case here. I mean, journalism is the one profession that ostensibly is protected in our Constitution. Our Constitution mentions no other professions, but journalism is believed to be necessary to a democracy. But there were police forces there, and they hired guards, not official police, so that they could do things that the police wouldn't do, like turn attack dogs loose on men, women, and children. And I mean, Amy Goodman was there with video cameras when these dogs were literally tearing flesh off of people who were peacefully protesting. Now, they are there to protest the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, a project that has militantly dug up sacred burial grounds that are on reservation property. And they were trying to simply stop the construction, not just because it was going through a burial ground, but because they also want to put a oil pipeline under the Mississippi River. What could go wrong? There are now more than 100 tribes represented in a camped-out demonstration in North Dakota, and they plan to stay there through the winter. They are asking for donations of winter camping gear, and that's what I hope we will do this year when we put up our Christmas tree and collect stuff for Christmas. I want primarily cold weather rated, low temperature rated sleeping bags, tents, and some of those chemical hand packs, warmers, that I will either ship or I will take to North Dakota. I haven't decided if I can afford the time in December to go up there myself or early January, but I'm inclined to go and spend some time with the Indians that are camped out there in North Dakota. And some of you may want to think about it and think about going with me if we can collect enough stuff to go. And I hope we can make this public, and I hope our internet audience will help us with this. You can either send cash for purchase of cold weather gear or ship cold weather gear to me, and I will get it to them.
We'll give you the time to go.
Do what?
We'll give you the time to go.
Okay, thank you.
Unfortunately,
That may mean you have to preach for me while I'm gone, Mel. It's all right.
unfortunately, Hillary now has decided that the pipeline would be a bad idea.
Well, President Obama has put a temporary stay on it. My fear is that after the vote in November, after the presidential election, that the fact that it's $3.5 billion will get it done rather than doing the right thing. And it's not the suspicion that a pipeline might leak. Pipelines leak This is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Pipelines leak under the Mississippi River in Dakota when all that water comes down to supply cities all the way down to New Orleans. I mean, this couldn't be more stupid, and yet there's a lot of money behind it. Major news networks will almost never mention opposition to a multi-billion-dollar construction project. Just won't be mentioned, even when water, land, and sacred Native American space is threatened. I'll leave you today with a modern saying, which I believe comes from the Osage tribe. When the last tree has been cut down, the last fish caught, the last river poisoned, only then we will realize that one cannot eat money. It's a small thing, but I encourage you to sign the petitions on the Daily Cause site to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Amen. And sign the petition asking President Obama to permanently stop construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. These seem like symbolic gestures, but I believe we have to change the language to change the way we think. And I hope that you'll join with me in acquiring cold weather camping gear to support the many tribal members who plan to stay there to make sure that if they have to physically block construction, that they will do that. Let's join our hearts with the Indigenous peoples who are not protesters or demonstrators, but are in fact protectors of our land.
Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.